I don't know what the Boston Bruins should do next, but what's most concerning is that I don't think they know what they should do next either. After a decade-plus streak of making the playoffs and being a competitive team, the Boston Bruins finally fell off a cliff in 2024-25, missing the playoffs and finishing with the 5th worst record in the NHL, with only 76 points on the year, tied with Philadelphia Flyers and Seattle Kraken, below teams like the Sabres, Ducks, Penguins, and Islanders. But with that aura of being a perennial contender around the Bruins, their fall-off this year was more surprising than just about any other team in the NHL, as they went from persistent playoff bully to now a lottery team in just the span of 1 year. So what happened and what is the path forward for the Boston Bruins? And we should start there with what the Boston Bruins should be looking to do this offseason. With teams I covered previously in this series, there were very clearly defined paths forward for the Sharks and Blackhawks. It was continue the rebuild, load up on young assets, and identify the window to go all in and add. For the Nashville Predators, they were just kind of locked into a lot of older contracts, so they kind of had to retool on the fly. For the Boston Bruins, though, it's a very different situation because they are locked into a lot of big contracts, including the likes of Charlie McAvoy and David Pastrnak that were already on their books, but they also made big additions in the offseason last year with guys like Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov, who are only 1 year into their big deals. Throw in that big re-signing of Jeremy Swayman and the other contracts they already have, and the Bruins are projected to have about $66 million committed to 5 forwards, 4 defensemen, and 2 goaltenders. Yes, they have $29 million in cap space projected, but they have to re-sign a bunch of RFAs, including guys like Mason Lohrei, Jacob Lauko, and Morgan Geekie, among many others. This team needs to add depth in this offseason, and they do not have a ton of cap space to do so. But on the other hand, while they did trade away some assets at the deadline, they're not in a position to really jumpstart a rebuild this year. They only have 1 first-round pick, 2 second-round picks, and a third-round pick this year. Compare that to a team like Pittsburgh, who has been more committed to the rebuild. They have 2 first-rounds this year, a second-rounder, and 3 third-rounders. The Bruins just do not have enough ammunition to get a rebuild started in earnest. And in addition, the players who have the most value if the Bruins were to commit to a rebuild are guys that they probably don't want to trade. Players like Jeremy Swayman, who's 26, Charlie McAvoy's 27, and David Pastrnak, 28. They're just not going to be able to get good value for trading guys like Hampus Lindholm, Nikita Zadorov, or Elias Lindholm. The Bruins are quite frankly caught in a quagmire, which makes them a very unappealing destination for any potential head coaching candidate or GM candidate. At least that's what I would have said if they hadn't committed to bringing back Don Sweeney and Cam Neely, the 2 guys who got them into this terrible situation. Now, in an ideal world, I would be recommending that they move on from both of those guys, given their horrible mismanagement of the cap and their lackluster drafting record, shall we say. And bringing them back is just kind of foolish because I don't think that they're going to full commit to a rebuild and instead do that competitive retool that's going to kind of leave them in the exact same situation. Maybe they'll pray that they hit the lottery on this pick and a guy like Misa Higgins or Schaefer can elevate them, but honestly, Bruins kind of just need to blow up the whole structure, bring in some new people, and just admit that they're going to be bad for the next 2 or 3 years. If you want to hold on to Pasta, McAvoy, and Swayman, that's fine, but you're going to be burning off some of their prime years until you're able to unload some of these terrible contracts and restock the farm system, which, by the way, is currently considered to be the 2nd worst in the entire NHL by the hockey writers. So again, not like there are many reinforcements that are going to be coming in to help this team next year. But okay, let's say that the Bruins are committed to being a competitive rebuilder for the next few years with Neely and Sweeney at the helm, even though I think that's just ridiculous. Who are they going to have behind the bench to lead this group next year? Well, obviously they got rid of Jim Montgomery, who has gone on to massive success in St. Louis, and replaced him with Joe Sacco, who, shocker of all shocker, was no good. Who can they hire? Well, I did a video breaking down all of the potential coaching prospects out there for NHL teams, and if the Bruins are not committed to rebuilding, I think that they should go with somebody who has some upside but has coaching experience. And the guys I would love to see them target are either Rick Tocchet, who was just recently let go of Vancouver, Jay Woodcroft, the former Edmonton Oilers head coach, or in this one's wishful thinking, Mike Sullivan, former head coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins. However, I think all of those guys could have other more attractive options out there, so I can see them falling to the next tier of experienced head coaches, guys like John Tortorella, Peter Laviolette, Joel Quenneville, Bruce Boudreau, or even guys like Don Granato, Dan Bylsma, or Lane Lambert. None of these guys should be particularly exciting to Boston Bruins players or fans, but I absolutely see a world where Peter Laviolette is announced as the next head coach of the Boston Bruins, and this team is just mediocrity embodied for the next 2 to 3 years. If the Bruins want to be aggressive and maybe commit to a rebuild and get a guy with upside, go local and go to Boston University and hire Jay Pandolfo, their current head coach, who's led the Terriers to some success in his tenure as their head coach. He would be a great add as head coach of the Bruins. But now let's turn to the roster, and as I mentioned, the Bruins really don't have a lot of avenues to make big additions in the offseason because of the salary cap constraints they're going to be running into. They have so many guys that they have to re-sign, and they have to fill out their depth chart. But taking a look at their current depth chart, they were definitely hurt later in the year by not having their set of defensemen with guys like Hampus Lindholm and Charlie McAvoy being out at the end of the year. With those guys back, in my opinion, they have 2 top 4 defensemen in their midst already. And in my opinion, Charlie McAvoy, when healthy, is still a legitimate number 1 defenseman. Jason Lohrei, in my opinion, is developing nicely, but hasn't yet earned himself to being called a legitimate top 4 defenseman in the NHL. And on the forward core, you have a couple of guys who I think you could call top 6 wingers in Morgan Geekie and Pavel Zacha. But the only legitimate first line player that you have on your roster is David Pastrnak. And what's worse is that the Bruins are extremely thin down the middle. Guys like Elias Lindholm and Casey Middlestat are not top 6 centers in the NHL on a competitive team. And unfortunately, the Bruins just do not have the ammunition or cap space to go after a first line center in the offseason, so that's going to still be in goal. I think Jeremy Swayman is definitely a legitimate number 1 goaltender, but I don't think he's a workhorse type guy. I think you still have to have a very solid backup behind him if you want to be effective. So all in all, for the Boston Bruins to be very competitive next year, they need at least a number 1 center, a number 2 center, probably at least 1 more top 4 defenseman, and a good backup goaltender. That is a tall task for a team that is very thin already in terms of depth and doesn't have players in their system who can backfill those roles that they would leave open if they were to free up cap space to go after those big time names. So in all honesty, I don't see a world where the Boston Bruins are competitive at all next year, which is why I went with the blow it up path when designing their offseason. This offseason, if I was the Boston Bruins, the name of the game would be keep your young RFAs and trade away whatever bloated contracts other than the big 3, Pastrnak, McAvoy, and Swayman, that you possibly can. The guys I would focus on trading would be Pavel Zacha and Casey Middlestat. I know losing Zacha would really hurt Bruins fans, but he's on a very reasonable contract and you could probably get at least a 2nd round plus to move him, and Casey Middlestat will probably fetch you maybe a 2nd or a 3rd rounder. I would also explore trading away Hampus Lindholm just because he's older, and like I said, a legitimate top 4 defenseman. Somebody would be interested in him. You could get a pick for him as well, and then let UFAs like Henry Jokiharju and Parker Witherspoon leave in free agency, try and backfill their spots with younger talent, give guys like Mason Lohrei a bigger role on the defense, and up front do the same. Let guys like Matt Platra, Fabian Lysell, Dean Latorno take that next step and try and get them big minutes and experience while you're rebuilding. Depending on who you draft in the 1st round, they'll probably take a spot. Maybe you'll get lucky and it'll be Schaefer who can play on your back end. If it's a forward like Higgins or Misa, you can put them up front. Maybe bring in a young backup for cheap, see if they can develop. And I know on here I have guys like Nikita Zadorov, Andrew Peeke, and Elias Lindholm on here. Those are just under the assumption that you cannot trade those guys, but if the Bruins somehow manage to find a taker for them, absolutely trade away those contracts. And if you're a Bruins fan and you're looking at this depth chart saying, how the hell are we supposed to win with this group? Well,
that's the neat thing. You don't.
Yeah, ultimately, I think next year the Bruins are just going to be bad. They have to swallow their medicine for a year or 2 just to restock the prospect pool, flush out those bad contracts, like I said, and rebuild the culture with the exact same guys who got you into this quagmire. But hey, that's just what I would do. Unfortunately, with Cam Neely and Don Sweeney behind the helm, get ready for the Bruins to take a run at Brock Nelson and run it back with a pretty mediocre top 6, an atrocious bottom 6, and a shaky back end as they continue to spin their wheels for another year.